a reminder. Okay, great, we're on. Okay, so without further ado, I'll hand over to Emma to say a few words of introduction.
Thanks so much, Dean. Good morning and good afternoon to the co-organisers and participants from government agencies, partner utilities and colleagues. On behalf of ADB, I'm really pleased to open this webinar on the important theme of climate change and disaster resilience. At the outset, I want to appreciate PWWA for playing a central role in facilitating the WASH webinars in coordination with the water utilities, development partners and learning institutions. ADB is really pleased to have the opportunity to contribute to brokering knowledge and learning activities through this specific WASH webinar series. And I'm sure we have much more exciting topics and interesting discussions ahead of us in this series. I think, as we all know, climate change has had a profound impact on Pacific countries, and with the overlay of the COVID-19 pandemic still there, the outcomes have been not as anyone would have hoped for, and given us much to think about and to work towards addressing. Certainly, while the smaller countries have remained mostly COVID-free, we've seen fragile economies really impacted due to prolonged border closures and travel restrictions. And this has directly affected both the commercial and the technical operations of utilities, delaying the implementation of infrastructure projects, making the delivery of sustainable WASH services even more challenging. So a key factor for all infrastructure investment programs post-COVID will be to consider climate change adaptation and mitigation, financial sustainability, inclusiveness and innovation in the design of projects in the anticipation, unfortunately, of future shocks coming from climate change and natural disasters. We really need a very long-term view to aim for quality and resilient infrastructure. I think we also all know that water is at the heart of climate change. We've certainly heard this message over the past 2 weeks as the world gathered in Glasgow to discuss and tackle climate change during COP26. We live in the most vulnerable region to the impacts of climate change, and thus we say the battle against climate change will be won or lost in Asia and the Pacific. Besides project-level interventions, we need comprehensive climate actions, capacity supplementation when human resources are constrained, and thinking around procurement and operational innovations that are really relevant to the Pacific-specific situations. Building climate and disaster resilience is at the core of ADB's Pacific approach, which guides our Pacific operations. The Pacific approach endorses a strategy of supporting a resilient Pacific with a strong focus on COVID-19 economic recovery. So infrastructure development and improving the quality of services is a key objective of the Pacific approach. So in closing, I'd really like to look forward to learning new insights from the session today, and I certainly wish all the participants a dynamic and fruitful discussion that ideally will lead to tangible actions by Pacific governments and utilities in building water resilience. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Emma. Thanks for leading us off there. Lucia, I'll hand over to you for a few words.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you, Emma, for those overarching themes around this subject that we are to discuss today. I think there's no escaping the fact that the world is already experiencing changes in average temperature, shifts in the season, and an increasing frequency of extreme weather events. But are we in the Pacific water secure and resilient? The fact remains that we in the Pacific are one of the most disaster-affected regions in the world. And we know from scientific data available that the frequency and magnitude of natural hazards and their impact are likely to increase during the coming years. Combined with sea level rise, insufficient and uncoordinated efforts in water resource management, waste management, poor infrastructure, and dwindling safe water sources, collectively we have a water crisis on our hands. This year, the role of water in climate change was brought to the forefront, and we heard that during the COP26 activities and discussions. Last year, it was the role of water in COVID. And these crises combined means we needed to act yesterday. We have heard and witnessed the delayed progress on SDG 6 through improvements in safe access, in water supply and sanitation, water resource management, especially in our region. And yet, I think there are maybe only 3 countries in the Pacific DMCs whose nationally determined commitments or NDCs to meet their Paris commitments have a section on adaptation with a strong focus on water resource management. These countries are PNG, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. And what is that saying? Perhaps that nationally we either are unaware of how climate change impacts water, or simply there is a lack of coordinated efforts on the importance of water, or lack thereof in respect of climate, or we are failing to draw that link. We need to enhance our efforts and integration across all the water subsectors and better identify the cross connections that need to be made between water and other sectors, given water's integration in many of the SDGs. To build water resilience, utilities will need a transformational shift to working with other stakeholders in all other sectors of the economy to build our resilience. It is no longer business as usual. We need to develop adaptation solutions formed on the basis of data made readily available to everyone. In essence, we need integrated efforts among stakeholders. We need better data, better analysis, better policy options, better capacity to implement actions that respond to the impacts of climate change that are already happening, as well as prepare us for future impacts. Thank you, ADB, for drawing attention to this issue of building water resilience in a changing climate. And thank you to our speakers today for your willingness to share your expertise and knowledge with the rest of us. Thanks, Dean.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Lucia. A lot of words of wisdom there. And I think that really sets the scene for the presentation today about how we set these frameworks up to make sure that there's an integrated approach. So without any further ado, I'll share my screen again and we will hand over to Bapon to lead us off. Okay, welcome.
Right, thank you so much, Dan. Do you able to share your screen?
Oh yeah, I've got to do that, eh? Catch me every time. Okay.
Right, and probably I am just asking for a request and control. So thanks everyone. Again, I think Emma as well as Lucy actually set out a quite strong scenario that last 2 weeks, whoever actually attended the water pavilion in COP, we actually saw actually how complex the situation is and how vulnerable we are, especially on the Pacific perspectives in the water sector. And how we actually, the question then remains actually, what happened when actually climate breaks out the rules and we actually still need to support our community as a basic water services, as well as making sure our water sector is sustainable, efficient, and effective, and how we can ensure that our institution and their operation continue to survive and thrive despite shocks and stresses. So I'm just going to share an analytical framework for an integrated water resource management to effective national water resource management, as well as a commitment by the Pacific to the Sustainable Development Goal 6, how we can actually achieve those through a integrated process. Right, next slide. Right, so I'll be just a little bit go through the water sector challenges, how the coherence is necessary or harmonization is needed for policy plans and strategies, as well as what does an analytical framework means to us, how does that conceptually means, how that computationally means, and how that actually need to be linked up with our national goals as well as SDG if we want to achieve, and what are the indicators actually we may need to consider, and what are the relationship between them, and through an example. As you can see that there are actually complex relationship between the climate change as well as the climate change indicator that creates some cascading and compounding extreme event, which is water induced mostly, you can see, and that create a severe impact to our sector by the differential impact assessment. So water actually play a quite cross-cutting and important key role. And we can actually say that water resilience is the language of climate action. If you need to be an action in the climate change, you need to be make sure that you are actually water resilience to making that happen for our sectors. In terms of challenges, I mean, obviously, due to our demographic as well as location, and also there are series of climate change driver, our water sector is significantly, especially on the freshwater availability, is quite scarce in the island level. Whatever actually the risk assessment actually done in the various process, various sector, we actually saw there is either there's too much water or there is too less water. So there's an imbalance between the overall water resource within the seasonal perspectives. There's huge data gaps to understand the exposure of vulnerability in terms of how the water, food, and environmental nexus works together, and as well as inadequate quality and quantity, as well as limited coverage of sewerage and wastewater treatment is a challenges. And also there is a rapid depletion of groundwater in the aquifer, leading to inequality of water accessibility, as well as maybe saltwater intrusion in many of the island. And it has been also said that unless a significant action actually we don't take by 2050, there will be the people who are actually suffering at this moment, that will be increased additional 40%. So you can actually see what is actually coming to us. And also, when you're looking at the policy aspect, there are multiple policy. If you go here, I just put together an example for New Zealand. I'm sure if you go any Pacific island, either Tonga, Samoa, Vanuatu, there are a series of policy plans and strategy actually built up. And then if you like to look at the harmonization or integration, how actually they looked at water, that actually sometimes missing. And that is quite important, that as a water, it's a cost-cutting activities, how we actually make sure that it's harmonized and integrated within the overall integrated water resource management plan. In some countries, they may achieve the IWRM, or they're able to actually subdivide the IWRM, but there are actually a missing part, how actually IWRM actually linkage with the climate change activities, disaster risk reduction, or other environmental activities. So it needs to have a little bit more integrated and cohesive action. And in that perspectives, we actually, both the United Nations, like the Sustainable Development Goal, as well as if you look at the Paris Agreement, and also last 2 weeks from the COP discussion, it actually demanded the increase macro level planning for national water resource governance, analysis, and assessment based on the integrated approach and with the future climate change scenario. And this requires actually the risk of water infrastructure, availability, pricing, demand, and resource to be analyzed within a framework that could allow us to better understand what are our future economic, environmental, ecological, and social challenges we will be facing in the future. And here you can see a computational framework that we developed, which is combined with the conceptual framework that actually built up with the process. So you actually engage the stakeholder to understand the problems, identify your objectives, analyze the problems, and then evaluate and present. And then you need to do a quantification of those problems, which is using an analytical framework. So you have climate change scenario, you have land use and other database, and how those database actually help you to better understand your water allocation, sectoral demand, environmental demand, and using a more risk assessment perspectives. There are several frameworks that has been exist to understand those kind of overall climate change and disaster risk into the sectors or water resource perspectives. ADB also play a pivotal role actually since 2015 by AWGO framework, which look at more 5 domain, how actually we can enhance the human, disaster, and social and economic perspectives of the water sector risk. There are also climate change risk assessment guidelines by ADB as well as IPCC and many other institutions to looking at how we can actually really look at exposure, vulnerability, and consequences of water sectoral and as well as climate change induced hazard, and how that actually create an impact, so that you can have a sort of interactive GIS platform that could enable you to provide sort of understanding that what is actually current status, what is going to be happen in the future. And it always need to be tie up with your national objectives, because as every single country, we have our national development goal, we have our national priority, or we have our people's plan. And if you look at in the country perspectives, here I just put an example here again for New Zealand. In New Zealand, our national policy objective is economic development, quality of life, ecosystem, recreation, as well as our indigenous and Maori well-being and identification. And how actually you can set up a criteria that could actually enable us to understand actually what are our national objectives priority could play a dominant role in the water sector, and how actually we can actually understand and analyze and allocate it and make sure that water is actually available for their resource management perspectives. So here are some examples that we put together, which we call like a state indicator that actually help us to play. It could be flood attenuation, it could be water retention, water quality, wastewater management, salinity control, tide, sediment, or waste assimilation. This indicator could be changed based on your decision-making process, because the situation is complex and is highly dynamic. So you need to adopt your indicator based on the decision that you need to provide or you have to take. Just giving an example here, for the flood attenuation and drainage, which is quite critical because flood is a common problem for all of us. So how actually you can understand the peak flood, duration of the flood, onset flood, or recession of the flood, or maybe looking at the retention perspectives, how the groundwater recharge is playing in the island level, because that's also one of the critical aspects, and how actually the soil moisture and other actually making sure that the agriculture and other sector are actually self-sufficient. And looking at more on the decision support, decision support indicator perspectives. As I said that again, I'm giving an example here for New Zealand, and I think it's quite similar to Pacific perspectives as well, looking at our economic development, which is more on GDP, production of agriculture, or production of our asset. Similar to Maori, we also need to look at actually how our Pacifica process or guiding principle, like how our connectedness, how our relationship, how we look at our family, how we engage, how we're looking at the collectivism as well as prosperity. So those actually need to be considered, as well as in the recreation, maybe swimming or fishing or boating, those could be looked at. And it could be vary country to country depending on their priority. And while you're trying to understand a relationship between your national development goal, also as a non-binding commitment, you are committed to the SDG 6, which is more on sustaining water supply and sanitation. So you will see actually there is a quite strong relationship between this indicator that you are trying to be looking at, and also the decision that you need to take. So an example here, you can look at that how actually the water protected area is actually playing to the other decision-making indicator, and red is actually quite significant relationship. Yellow means, or orange means moderate relationship, and green means actually there is a less relationship between the indicator versus state indicator versus the decision-making indicator that you have to take. And what does it mean ultimately for your decision-making process? When you're looking at a sample example, if you want to take a project at the country level, you actually can define actually how the project is actually helping the problems, which is basically your maybe a flood is a problem, drought is a problem, or water quality is a problem, and then how actually that actually helping you to achieving your targets for the SDG as well as target for your national development goal. Here I just given an example here. So if you just look at a project, for an example, a central interceptor, how actually it connected with your change in state indicators. So that obviously regulating your flood attenuation, water retention, water quality, and then also habitat, as well as it also impacting your Maori culture as well as indigenous culture, and then how that actually creating overall impact in your national development goals. So that gives you a quite good quantification. And as a policymaker, we always actually want to know some numbers so that we make sure that if you want to invest $100, how much actually what benefit it will bring back for the community, and how much impact actually it will create to the society. And then finally, it could give you a sort of decision-making process to making alternative strategies. Either it could be orange strategies, green strategies, red strategies, or maybe do nothing strategy, and how that could create an outcomes and meeting your target objectives. And then when you try to looking at your impact assessment, you can actually understand how much money you need, how easy it needs to be implemented, what are the people's interests, because it needs to have a quite strong engagement, as well as environmental implication, because that's also quite important for the perspectives. And I think that's all I'd just like to say. And one of the important feature for this IWRM or analytical framework is to provide a structural approach based on the consensus and required information. The framework connected 3 important parties and stakeholders, which is our planners, or resource analysts, as well as decision makers. And this framework can determine the changes of utilization and availability of water resources and the water resource system itself. So the analytical framework could be able to help us to making a climate change impact, and as well as ensuring our ecosystems as well as social and economic condition for different resource users as well as society as a whole. I think that's my last slide. Thanks. Feel free to ask me any question. Happy to answer at any point. Over to you, Glenn.
Great, thanks, Bapon. I'll just take my screen back. Hang on, where's my mouse? There it is. So thanks. Is that sharing again? Yep. So yeah, happy to take any questions. Stick them in the chat if you've got some questions. But otherwise, yeah, thanks for setting out the framework there, Bapon. So it'd be really interesting to see how that's been applied in other countries. I might hand over to Elisiva from Tonga Water Board now to take us forward with some discussion about the situation in Tonga. Morning, Elisiva.
Thank you, Dee. Good day, everyone. I'm just giving a little background on the climate change, impact of climate change in Tonga, source of water and its challenges, and a way forward. Tonga is one of the 52 small island development states, highly susceptible to the impact of climate change and disaster due to its geographical, geological, and socio-economic characteristics. Climate change and natural disaster pose severe adverse threats on the environment, the people of Tonga, and their livelihoods. Scientific findings reveal that this impact would be exploited by future climate change. Next one, team. The climate change impact. And the cyclones are the most frequent occurring disaster in Tonga. Average 1.3 tropical cyclone affected Tonga per year. The worst cyclone disaster in Tonga occurred in 1982, killed about 6 people and affected 146 people, 146,000. Additional to cyclone is natural hazard in Tonga, include earthquakes and volcanic activities. Because Tonga lies in a close proximately to the Australian Pacific tectonic plates in the most seismically active region in the Pacific. Tonga is vulnerable to tsunami. Most recent tsunami in Tonga was in September 2009, killed 9 people, and waves were around 6 to 17 meters high, affected areas of inland of about 600 meters, destroyed many villages with a total cost of $9.5 million US. Climate pattern is highly vulnerable to the effect of El Nino. Generally occurs once in every 3 to 7 years and always coincides with drought incidents. Next one, Dean, please. We'll look at the source of water and its challenges in Tonga in perspective of Tonga Water Board. Fresh water for Tonga is either rainwater harvesting or extraction from thin freshwater lands within the highly processed limestone substrate. Groundwater is used domestically for cooking, bathing, food, preparation, plants, animals, sewage, and general cleaning. It is piped to homes, government buildings, businesses, industry, and tourist accommodation by Tonga Water Board in the urban centers of Nuku'alofa. Many villages outside of these centers have their own water system administered by water communities. Tonga Water Board water supply is metered at each property. Most villages are currently introducing the individual meters. Each island within each group has varied water resources issues and concern depending on population pressure, demand, the quality and quantity of water supply, local geologies, agricultural and sanitation practices, and extraction standards. Water used for agricultural purposes is not documented, and water drawn from village water supply system is not metered. Number of pores are operating in Tongatapu or in the other islands group is unknown, as it's the extracted volume. Tonga does not have centralized reticulated sewage system. All wastewater is managed by on-site system with supervision by the Ministry of Health when resources are permit. Wastewater management is in the hands of the community. Poorly constructed or inappropriate sanitation systems are common, resulting in the potential of pathogen introduction into the surrounding environment, including groundwater system. Next in, please. There's no information on database or data exchange system on water resources available for water resources assessment and monitoring, nor is a national hydrological network. Water resources are currently managed by a number of institutions, some of which deal with specific or general monitoring. Disaster or emergency that could affect water resources in Tonga includes chemical pollution from pesticides, fertilizers, and oil or industrial components, and extreme weather events such as cyclones, earthquakes, drought, and flooding. Beach mining for sand and aggregate dead coral have also increased the impact of storm on coastal areas. Economic impact on intuitions has also affected towns and allotment, resulting in the abandonment of homes and crops. Lastly, we look at the way forward. Tonga has a Tonga National Disaster Management Plan. In addition to National Emergency Management Committee, National Disaster Management Office, they deal with the disaster management mechanism. Demand for management measures, water supply, augmentation, drought, vulnerability assessment, and climate forecasting can all help towards greater disaster preparedness. Institutional and regulatory support is required to effectively prepare for and manage disaster and to reduce the impact of climate and variability of freshwater resources. Legislation has been introduced to support a sustainable approach to it. Requires approval and funding allocation for implementation in the perspective of Tonga Water Board. And last is the Village Water Supply Committee requires financial and technical assistance in additional to and on the job training to establish and maintain the water supply system. Malo Alpito. Thank you, Dean.
Malo Pito Elisida. Yeah, really. Yeah, thanks a lot for that presentation. So it's really interesting to see the linkages and the things you're doing in Tonga and the framework that Bapon was talking about.
Yes,
and
yes.
how you've got the challenges there in Tonga, but the institutional frameworks and regulatory supports now being put into place to help to address those.
Yes.
Yeah. So did anyone have any questions before we move on and hear from Chris? So please feel free to raise your hand or put the questions in chat. as we go through. Okay, Chris, I'll hand over to you.
Alrighty, I'll grab control if I can, Dean. Just because I need the I need to be pointing.
Okay, there we go.
All right. Oh, I've got a bit of lag. Can I go back? Yep. Sorry. So I'm Chris, and I'm an environmental scientist or a hydrogeologist for TNT, Tonkin and Taylor, and I'm presenting on a project we did up in Rarotonga back in 2014, and we were looking at potential groundwater resources for drinking water supply. For Rarotonga, they had a whole bunch of issues with their existing surface water supply, which were up there to try and find a potential for solution for that. So I'll talk through some of the drivers around that and some of the issues that they had with that that existing supply, and a bit about what we did up there, and some of the challenges that we kind of faced while we were up there on the ground, and then look to try and kind of expand that out maybe into some sort of broader reflections about the challenges associated with that kind of work, and looking for new sources of groundwater. I was up there, so my role when I was up there was I was up there for a couple of months, kind of coordinating all the field work. So we had a drilling program, which I'll talk about. But I need to recognise that it was kind of 7 or 8 years ago now, and the water supply that I'm about to talk about in terms of the challenges of that has moved on a bit since then. So it's not quite the same as it was, and I know they've done a whole bunch of work up there. So yeah. For avoidance of doubt, Rarotonga is up here. I'm sure most of you know exactly where it is. So it's up here on the eastern side of the Pacific. It's about a 3 or 4 hour flight from Auckland in New Zealand, and it's a really popular tourism destination for Kiwis when we try and escape our winter down here in kind of April through September, and also for Australia too. So it gets this influx of tourists during that time, which is one of the challenges I'll talk about in a second. But this is kind of what it looks like from the aerial view, and the first thing that kind of jumps out is it's your classic Pacific Island kind of volcanic cone with this really steep interior block of volcanic rock. That's a caldera, actually fringed by this kind of coastal margin that's quite flat. Most of the population lives on this outside bit, and access to this interior is pretty tricky. You can see these really steep incised valleys with quite short surface water streams coming out of it, out discharging to the coast. Yeah, and as I say, this is where most of the population lives on that outside. So there's quite a lot of pressure on this land for people living and doing agriculture and those sorts of things on that land. In terms of the water supply, it looked a bit like this at the time. So they've got 11 surface water supplies up in the hills of various sizes coming from little streams, and there was no treatment on and very little storage at the time. And so effectively what was happening was that there'd be rainfall, and the intakes would kind of fill up, and there's a photo later on of the Avana intake, but they would fill up and they would just discharge straight into these networks around the island. So there's a ring main or a couple of ring mains that run around the whole island, and they feed these various sectors here. On the eastern side, these intakes here are quite small streams and very short catchments, and so very vulnerable to kind of low rainfall events. So what had been happening leading up to our trip up there was that they'd had a number of dry years, I think exacerbated by climate change, which was a bit of a theme for this project. But they were starting to run out of water because those dry periods, well, the dry season in Rarotonga aligned with when they were getting this influx of tourists from New Zealand and Australia. So they had a peak in demand and a trough in water availability, which was meaning that this Avana intake was propping up. You can see it props up this eastern side. So they were looking for a source of water, more stable source of water to kind of augment what was happening on this eastern side. So that was one of the objectives, as I set out here. So they had some other challenges with an aging network. I mentioned that ring main, which had there was significant leakage from that, and at the time there was a project underway with the Chinese government to, or that had provided some funding to replace that ring main. Nothing was metered, so some of the sort of water use practices that I saw up there weren't that great. Lots of leakage coming out of laterals, and people using water for stuff that it probably didn't need to be used for. As I said, little or no storage to kind of buffer out those drier periods. Those smaller streams and really short incised catchments meant that, not only were they susceptible to dry periods, but also when they had lots of rain, they had turbidity issues, and so they would have to shut the supplies down. So there was kind of this narrowish window of opportunity sometimes where they could actually use the water. It was either too much rainfall and it was turbid and they couldn't use it, or it was not enough. And as I said, no treatment really to speak of. I think at the time, again, they were installing UV as a for bacteriological contamination. So our project objectives were really ultimately came back to improving water security, particularly for that eastern side. So both in terms of quality and quantity, and to so we're looking for a more resilient and reliable source of water. Essentially, I think what they were looking for was a bore or bore fields that they could have sitting there, and when there was a dry period or a need for water, they could come along and drop a pump into that and pump directly into the network, rather than having something sitting there ticking away all of the time. It was kind of an emergency response type thing, and because of that, they needed relatively high water quality, so good quality water that they didn't need to treat. So we installed 5 wells up there, and while we're up there with the drill rig, we also rehabilitated a bunch of other monitoring wells that were kind of dotted across the other side of the island. This is a photo of the actual drill rig we had up there, and we were developing a well this time, which is big towers of water coming out. We leading up to the trip, we'd obviously done a bunch of research into the geology and hydrogeology to see what we could find in terms of planning bore locations and targeting particular resources of water. And I think just generally what we found was that there'd been a period in the kind of from the late 80s through to the late 90s where there'd been maybe 5 or 6 studies done on regional scale geology for the island, but nobody had actually really gone up there and done much meaningful drilling and investigation. It was kind of like we couldn't really burrow down beyond the regional geology very much, and that's what we're seeing here on this right-hand side was essentially what we went up there with in terms of our understanding of how that system worked in the hydrogeology there, which is very sparse. So essentially, what we're looking at is that kind of big mountainous interior is a big block of basalt. As I said, it's a caldera, and when we got up there, we found that's actually, there's very little fracturing on it in it, and very low potential for groundwater in it. So we kind of ruled out this whole big center of the island. These pink areas are lava flows, more recent lava flows. On the outside, there was this kind of coastal terrace called the Nicao Gravels, which is essentially material that's kind of eroded off that center and deposited around the outside of the island in a kind of like a slope. And because of that material was really variable. Sometimes it was quite gravelly, and other times quite sandy and consolidated and fine grained. So predicting where groundwater was going to be in that was really, really challenging. And then beyond that, you've kind of got this sandy area that's coastal, coral gravels and sands around the outside, with your lagoon and barrier reef. And we'd kind of immediately ruled out that sand as a potential source of groundwater, just purely on the basis of the fact that it was going to have pretty low resilience to climate change. This is what that same picture looks like in section, and you'll have to excuse the hand-drawn sketch, but I think it makes it look a bit authentic. Essentially, this is the Nicao gravels that I was talking about before, the material that's kind of eroded off, very, very highly variable, which had kind of come through in the literature research that we'd done with swamp deposits and the taro swamps and stuff like that on the fringe, and then these sand deposits underlain by coral with the lagoon there. again, making the point that 99.9% of the population lives in this kind of narrow bit here. So you've got quite a lot of pressure on, what we were doing was essentially wanting to target, a groundwater source up here, right on the edge of that, coming as far inland as we possibly could to get away from the coast. But with coastal retreat, that's what the population was also doing. So this, pressure on this land, this inland land, was getting to be quite high, which is a real challenge. This is the kind of the bore layout that we did. I won't dwell on this too much, but we drilled in 4 locations. We ended up drilling 2 bores down here at this location because it had quite a bit of promise to it. But yeah, this is the kind of the scale of the geology we were looking at. In terms of the results, I guess we generally struggled with the Ngakau gravels just because they were so variable. We did end up finding one location, that location where we drilled 2 bores that had quite promising yields, and we've back calculated and figured out after a bunch of pump testing and whatnot that we could probably get 400 cubes a day out of a 3 or 4 bore field there, which was quite promising in terms of yields and was certainly enough to be an augmentation supply to kind of keep things running through a drought. But downside of that was that when we came to do some water quality testing on it, we found it was really high in iron and manganese, which isn't particularly surprising given the volcanic background for that material. But those two constituents are quite hard to treat. It's not, they're not cheap and easy to treat with sort of standard treatment processes. And remembering that at the time that the island didn't have treatment infrastructure in place already to deal with that sort of stuff, so it was a pretty big step that would have been required to use that source. Also had quite high bacteriological, so we're finding E. coli in that source, largely because of I think those kind of the tug of war between land uses and that groundwater source. The other locations, either sort of fine grained, low yielding, or we kind of quite quickly punched through that gravel and into that basalt underlying it. So there wasn't really enough thickness of the gravel to get a decent supply out of it. Just moving on to kind of some of the broader challenges associated with that trip as a whole. I've made a bit of a big deal about this conflict on the coastal plains with land use and limited space and those sorts of things. And again, reiterating the point that I think that kind of coastal retreat thing is just putting more and more pressure on that kind of inland portion. We were wanting to do everything. Land ownership was challenging, and I guess my reflection going up there with a very European view of land ownership and how that works, I probably had expected that getting sign-off and approvals for certain bore locations and stuff was going to be a bit more straightforward than it was. Just because getting hold of people was quite tricky. And securing flat areas of their land to put a sort of semi-permanent bore on was often exactly where they'd kind of decided there was going to be a house site or a future house site, so they were quite keen to kind of preserve that land, which was fair. Saline intrusion at depth is, of course, as I said, almost ruled out that whole sort of sand, beach sand fringe, which actually in terms of yield and quality probably would have been all right in the short term, but grappling with saline intrusion risks were going to mean that kind of had a timestamp on it, particularly with over abstraction and those sorts of things that tend to kind of be tempting in drought times. And as I said, having a local scale understanding really challenged us. We kind of went in there and had to learn basically from scratch. We didn't have very much information kind of going into that. So there've been lots of high level assessments, but nothing local scale, like I said, and certainly no sort of hydrogeological work had been done. I guess the reflections kind of coming out of that were that some long-term monitoring networks that could have supported some modelling would have been really helpful. And I think across the Pacific and the other work that we're doing, we see often people wanting to tackle quite large challenges like understanding saline intrusion, starting from a point of having very little information and very little data, and often to support the quite high to support the quite detailed modelling required to kind of answer some of those really important questions requires years and years of data and an understanding of how those groundwater systems work, which requires kind of a constant investment in building that knowledge data set. The other reflection was that people tend to kind of go up to or people tend to do work in quite disparate pieces. So they might go and do a piece of work, and then that piece of work, instead of being built on necessarily, is kind of filed, and then the next time somebody comes up to do something else, it's kind of dusted off, but there's not this kind of continual build. And I think a lot of that relates to kind of having ongoing relationships with people, so that you're preserving that kind of institutional knowledge and not having to start from scratch all of the time. And that allows you to kind of have a long-term strategy around developing or understanding those groundwater sources, and being able to plan land use, and securing for source protection, and having monitoring programs that allow you to go into those situations with some certainty to model that out and say, okay, well, we know exactly how much water we can get out of this system because we've been monitoring it. And sometimes that requires a bit of courage. That's like you set up those monitoring networks without necessarily an absolute project objective in mind, but you just know that at the end of it, you're going to need that data for a whole bunch of uses, which generally aligns to what's happening in the drinking water regulatory reform space in New Zealand, which is something that we've been pretty heavily involved in, which is essentially placing much greater focus on understanding source catchments, and putting a real emphasis on managing those, so that you're protecting the source before it gets into the supply, and then you've got to treat it. That's it for me. Bit of an abrupt finish, I'm sorry.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Chris. That was really interesting to see the work you've done there. I'll just stop sharing my screen if I can. So yeah, we'll open it to the floor to questions. I think is Ken McDonald been able to join us? Let me have a look.
Yeah, I'm back, Dean. I'm here.
Hey, Ken. So yeah, Ken, thanks for joining us. Ken's also from Tonkin and Taylor, that worked on the Cook Islands project. So we were having a discussion preparing this webinar, and yeah, we thought we'd just invite Ken to give us a bit more background and a few observations there that we thought were really interesting. So over to you, Ken.
Thanks, Dean. Hi, everybody. Yeah, just by coincidence, a few years ago, as Chris Shanks was on Rarotonga doing the work he's just described, I was actually on the client side. I worked for the Ministry of Infrastructure up in the Cook Islands for 3 years, delivering some development partner projects in water and sanitation. So I had a bit of a different perspective from Chris, and it was great that the Tonkin Taylor guys came up there and did some amazing work in quite challenging circumstances. But I think, having seen it from the client perspective and having been there for a few years, it's probably useful to reflect on some of the wider perspectives and issues, the community perspectives and the social and cultural and in fact historical perspectives. Chris is highlighting there where the population of Rarotonga is now and where the stressors are. But historically, the population of Rarotonga actually lived inland. They didn't live near the coast, and there was a gradual migration towards the coast over time. And some of that was to do with water resources. Some of that was to do with the fact that the intakes and the clean water sources were inland historically, and over time people have migrated to the coast. I think Chris again talked about the land ownership and one thing I hadn't experienced since my childhood in Scotland actually was the extent to which there were very different family and tribal factions within very short spaces of time, which often affect those things as well. So you're in there trying to negotiate access to a piece of land, but you might be crossing or straddling boundaries between families and between different land ownership boundaries and different cultures within quite a short space of time and distance. And so it's important to take all those factors into consideration when planning those things. And I think the last thing for me, just briefly, is the political context on all this as well. At that time in Rarotonga, there were probably water and sanitation projects being delivered by about half a dozen different development partners, each with their own specific set of criteria and their demands on the politicians and the communities of Rarotonga. And that played out quite interestingly as well. And that makes decision making and reaching decisions and consensual decisions on the ground quite challenging sometimes. So those are, you know, aside from the obvious technical challenges that Chris has highlighted, there's a whole bunch of other things in there I think we've really got to be cognizant of and be continuously working on understanding and building into our planning and decision making. Thanks, Dean.
Excellent, thanks, Ken. That's yeah, really interesting perspective from the other side on that case study. So, yeah, I've really enjoyed it. So while people are still thinking of questions, a few reflections I had about, we talk about the enabling environment and so on the WASH TA side of things, but I think it's really interesting to reflect back on the strong enabling environment we need to have in place for all of our work, particularly where it links to the integrated water resource management problem and the competing land uses. And so, yeah, we need to make sure that's in place and work really strongly across the different sectors there. So in the water sector, we can't do this alone. So we need to make sure those strong linkages there at the government level and the strong enabling environments in place. We often come in and do master plan work as part of our business. And potentially that's too late to be starting to think about these water resource issues. It's relatively easy for engineering consultants to come in and design systems, design treatment plants and networks. But if you don't have a water resource plan in place and have a really good idea about where the water can come from, have the investigations done, some research in place, it's really difficult to come in and think, well, actually, I need to rely on work that should have been done 10 years ago. So, yeah, so I think the first step in making sure that we start to be resilient to climate change is making sure we've got all these things as a strong foundation in place. And then we can talk about the utility perspective on how we adapt in an engineering sense. So do we have any other questions or comments? Everyone's quiet today.
I just had one question to Itapululu from Tonga.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, actually. That's a quite interesting presentation you made actually on the Tonga Water Board. I'm just wondering, is there any process being ongoing to developing any kind of integrated master plan for Tonga Water Board, linking with some of the challenges that you just mentioned?
Thank you. Yes, right now we just passed our Water Act, Water Act 2020. We're working closely through WASH with Ministry of Health. So it's like Lucia was saying, this is our challenge, the reality, and we are moving forward to working with the Ministry of Health, Land and Survey, as well as the environment, integrating into our business plan. Thank you.
Thanks, Mapon. So do we have any final questions or comments? No, nothing's popped up. So we might actually finish close to being on time today, which is pretty rare for our webinar, so that's great. One thing that we'll do, we'd really like to get your feedback from the group here on what you'd like to explore in relation to climate change and the impacts that that'll have from our perspective, particularly on the utilities, but ability to deliver services and deliver WASH services to our communities. And one thing that we'd like to explore, I think, early in the new year is how the utilities are situated and how well prepared you are. So we've heard from Elisiva today about the work that's happening in Tonga. So yeah, it'd be really interesting, and yeah, so watch this space. But there might be some work that we do early next year to work with you as a utility group to potentially do some survey work just to see how you're situated now, where the gaps are in your preparedness, and where the opportunities are for some further assistance there. So that's one thing we would like to explore in the new year. But happy to get your feedback on other topics on the, that you'd like webinars on. That's really critical to all of us that we get this right. Oh, there's a question there from Jing Min. So yeah, one for you, Elisiva. I'm not sure if you can see the chat there. But how much can Tonga Water Board cover its O&M costs through tariff collection? I think you're muted there, Elisiva.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Dean. As you know, we have our tariff, but for our tariff, I think we can cover. With us, we can't control our tariff. It's political. So whatever we can have, but that's the only thing that we cover. We have a lot of special work coming. We have taken into account reviewing our tariff. We've been having our current tariff for the last 10 years. It's never been reviewed. So this is part of our challenge, Dean.
Yeah, I think we find that working with a few utilities,
Yes.
Elizabeth, it's
Yes.
Yep, excellent.
Thank you.
And Bronwyn's got a question. It might be one for Bapon or Chris. Maybe Chris about. I'm not sure if you can see the question in the chat there.
I can go ahead.
Yeah. Okay.
it
Yeah.
off.
Okay. Great.
And then Chris can supplement. I mean, that's quite important question actually raised, the data issue. And one of the things that we are trying to promote the fairness of the data, which is like how you actually make sure the data is actually findable, accessible, interoperable, as well as reusable. And unless you actually create an open data policy by the country, it would be very difficult to actually sharing those data into the open platform by the country by country. And also there are a lack of observation systems. I think there are some initiatives going through the WMO as well as other global organizations to how actually we enhance the networks to more observation and monitoring purpose. But I think that's need to happen more aggressively because you miss the data for today, you'll not get data for tomorrow actually. Chris, over to you.
Yeah, that's right. I think good points on, if you're going to collect data, make sure it's accessible and useful. I think the question sort of touches on the fact, what do you do when you don't have any data? I guess the first answer to that is try and go out and collect as much as you can, and obviously funding is a challenge. Typically, when we kind of face with that issue, there's a bunch of kind of quite conservative analytical approaches you can take. For example, MySpace, it's modeling saline intrusion issues into an aquifer with pumping and those sorts of things. So you can still do that stuff based on assumptions and based on analytical approaches that don't necessarily need that data. The compromise there is that you often end up with quite conservative results that don't always give you what you want. So that's kind of what you do in the meantime, I think, until you've got enough data or you're out collecting that data to support further, more detailed, more reliable modeling. In terms of, so the second part of the question is about, predicting the future. When you don't, you're kind of using the past to predict the future. I think, Bronwyn, feel free to unmute and constrain me on this, but I think essentially what you're doing is you're kind of going into that with conservatism first until you know exactly how it's going to play out. Again, having sort of monitoring and real-time systems that kind of can calibrate your prediction against what's actually happening to allow you to track, what you thought was going to happen against what's actually happening, and then kind of refine that as you go on. Is really where I think the future lies with this stuff, which requires a step change in terms of how we're managing these systems and keeping an eye on them.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And also, I think there will be always some uncertainty on the data. So especially when you're trying to looking at observation data for the understanding your hazard perspectives, but also there's a lacking on the data on the vulnerability assessment, which is more on socioeconomic and baseline database. And whatever model we create, there will be always a uncertainty, but actually as a manager, the challenge is actually how we actually deal with that uncertainty to making some understanding based on out of those data, how that create an information and knowledge for us. And in that case, we always try to rely more on the ensemble product so that actually we don't rely on one single database. We try to look at multiple data sets. It may be using a satellite observation. It could be using the monitoring system. It could be based on the other data that you have from the regionally. So how those data could help us to a little bit understanding the trend and what could be the probabilistic or answerable information that could provide us some little bit on the future trend tendency on the impact.
I think one of the other observations I'd have on that from some work we were doing is potentially the cross-sectoral nature of the data that we need to rely on for some of this. We've seen in some countries where there's not that a strong support across government sectors, that information we might rely on, such as rainfall data and stream gauges in catchments that's collected by someone else, isn't appropriately maintained. So I think as a utility, we really need to understand the data that we need, who can provide the data, and really be onto them to make sure we get high quality, reliable data. So that's one of those, the enabling environment and working across sectors there that we need to keep in mind as well, that I've seen. Did that answer your question there, Bronwyn?
Yeah, thanks, Dean. There are many more areas we could discuss, of course. And I think that today's focus seems to be around securing water supply. And I'd be interested in, in the future talking about other issues as well. But as you say, this is the start of a few webinars, so there'll be time for that.
Yeah, thanks, Bronwyn. Yeah, so start of a journey on this one. And really a lot of topics for us to explore. So it'd be great to get feedback from the group here about which ones we'd like to get into next. Sarah, we'll certainly be sharing the presentation from today. So we've had a couple of requests for that. So that'll go up on our ADB website with all of the materials from today. So look out for that one. And Jingmin, there's another question there about government subsidies to cover day-to-day O&M and major replacements. So I think that was a question for everybody. And that might be something we explore when we look at utilities, how you sit at the moment and preparedness, where the gaps are. And I think potentially one of the funding gaps might be that, to get this baseline data that we're after, but I'd be surprised if every country has got that covered, but that's something we might explore in a bit more detail. So how are utilities prepared and where are the gaps? And we'll try and do that early next year. And yeah, I think, okay, I think that's probably, we've got time for some more questions if people would like to stay around. Our presenters are always happy to have a chat. Any more questions going? Well, that's probably it from me. Before we close off, I'll hand over to Carl to finish us up today. I'd really like to thank our presenters from Tonkin and Taylor. So Bapon, Chris and Ken for his words on their experience there. And Ella Seaver, that was great to hear about the experience in Tonga. So that's all for me. So thanks. That's probably the last webinar that we'll do for this year with the mad season of Christmas coming up for a lot of us. And we'll certainly pick these up in January and hopefully we can continue the conversation on climate change. So thanks a lot for coming along today. Over to you, Carl.
Yeah, thanks, Dean. Thanks, everyone. I just thought of taking the few minutes as we close to share some reflections and my key takeaways from our webinar today. And I just picked up on the observation, and I couldn't overstate what Lucia, when she opened that Pacific region is the most disaster affected region. And I just find that huge disconnect that only 3 countries, given this scenario, that only 3 countries have so far clearly indicated clear water resources management plans and water security plans in their nationally determined contributions. So I find that there's a huge space for us to help countries in developing further their water resources management plans. I think the session we had on case studies shared by Ella Siva in Tonga, as well as the technical study in Robert Tonga, I think with Ella Siva, she was able to give a clearer message on the need to improve on strengthening information database. And I think it's also a challenge given that water is a cross-cutting theme. And so multiple agencies are responsible in looking after their mandates on water. And that gives a challenge on gathering data and organizing them. So there's also space for all of us to work together in improving database management. We could also systems in our future webinars if this is an area of interest for utilities and governments. Also, the presentation of Chris and Rarotonga, I think it's also important that we discuss about the technical aspects of water resources management, on how we improve water security. But for all of us non-technical people to understand the currents of water and the availability of water. And so this is something that we would like to probably share so that layman would be able to understand about occurrences of water, but also the intervention of Ken on giving a perspective on historical and cultural context of how we develop and exploit water resources in the countries. This is an interesting topic, and probably we could discuss that in the future webinars. In closing, I just wanted to pick up on the tagline that water resilience is the language of climate action. And so that's my key takeaway. I think coming from this webinar, we need to take action from what we've learned, from what the new knowledge that we've acquired is really translating them into actions. And so I think that there are a few priority actions that we could help these countries in helping them, especially in issues in addressing climate and disaster risks, where there's too much water that causes flooding, there's too little water during droughts, and probably also too dirty water, helping them to manage water quality. And so I end with those takeaway points, and I hope we could work together further in building water resilience in the changing climate. So thank you very much.
Family photo, Carl. We need a family photo.
I was about
cameras
to
on.
remind you
Yeah,
about that.
okay. Everyone turn their photos on. We'll get a happy holidays photo for all of us. All smiling faces.
Could you unshare your screen, Dean?
Oh, am I sharing? Am I?
Just to
How's that?
Check out those palm trees in the background.
It's only Newcastle. Okay, I think, has everyone got their screen shared? 1, 2, 3, happy holidays. Hopefully Maria's got the photo. So thanks again for everyone for coming, and great to see so many people along, and we'll catch up as a group again in the new year. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
See you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
I didn't get the best screenshot, Dean, but I will send it through.
Okay.
Right,
We'll
see ya.
add it to our photo album. Great.
No. Bye.
Okay, bye.